In this video, we're going to do exactly what we did in the previous video, but we're going to move a little bit faster now that we know how to look for these things. So I'm going to look at, let's do number 2 here. We're going to look for the midline. The midline is the halfway point. So I can see the maximum is 0, and I can see the minimum is -2. So therefore, I could use that formula to figure out the halfway point, but in this case, I can see where the halfway point is. That would be the midline, right here, midline at y equals -1. Remember, the midline is telling me the location of that halfway point, so I need to write it as an equation, y equals, at what y value is that blue line? Oh, it's at y equals -1. The maximum is a value, it's not a location, so I just say the max is equal to 0 and the minimum is equal to -2. Great, got that done. Can we figure out the amplitude? Sure. The amplitude would be the distance from the maximum to the midline, or from the midline to the minimum, whichever way you want to measure. And either way you measure, it looks like it's 1 unit, right? I see a lot of grid lines, but from 0 to -1, that's 1 unit. From -1 to -2, that's 1 unit. So the amplitude, the distance, the length, is 1. By the way, amplitude, I said it in the previous video, or previous video, amplitude has to be positive because it's always measuring a length. It's measuring a distance, and distance lengths are always positive. The last thing we need to find is the period. How long does it take for the cycle to complete? If you watched the previous video, we measured from maximum to maximum. And we could measure from here to here. But is that the most convenient way? Because now I'm going to have to say, how far is it from 3/4 all the way down to 7/4? You could do that. Or I could measure from minimum to minimum. But if I do that, so this is the period, and this is the period. If I do that, I got to measure from 1/4 all the way to 5/4. And so the third way you can measure the period is by starting at the midline and go a full valley and a full hill, and then stopping, because all of these green lengths are the same. You just need to figure out which one's the most convenient for you to use in order to figure out the period. So the period could be from maximum to maximum. That is the period. The period could be from minimum to minimum. Same value. Or it could be from a midpoint to the end of the cycle midpoint. And I know that it's the end because it goes through a full valley and a full hill, or a full hill through and a full valley. Either way, the length is 1. So period here is 1. And the period here is 1. And the period here is 1. That's it. We figured out these 5 pieces of information just by identifying them on the graph. We're going to do one more, and then in the next video, I'll show you how what we're doing here is connected to equations. But let's do one more. I kind of like number 3 here, so let's do this one. We can identify the max. The maximum value is 1. I can identify the minimum value. The minimum value is -5. Now, can you find the midline? By the way, if you haven't noticed, all of these graphs, they top out, they maximum at a whole number, and they minimum at a whole number. Sometimes we're given decimals, right? So here it's pretty easy. If these are whole numbers, I can just count 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Oh yeah, so the halfway point is at -2. But if that's not possible, or if you don't have a graph, but you have the maximum and the minimum, remember we can average these, add 1 plus -5, -4, and divide by 2, and you just found your midline. I guess I'm saying sometimes it's visually easy to calculate. Sometimes we have to use that formula. The midline is at y equals -2. Got it. What's the amplitude? The distance from here to here. So the amplitude is 3. And then finally, what's the period? Well, again, we can measure from max to, oh wait, I can't see the next max. I guess I could go backwards and I can go from max to max. That's the period. I could also go from a midline to hill, there's a valley, so from here to here, that's a period. Or I can use from minimum to minimum, and the only reason I'm going to use this bottom one is because I know that I'm starting at 0 and I'm ending at 2 pi. So therefore, the distance between 0 and 2 pi is 2 pi. It's also the same distance here, and it's also the same distance here. So if you understand what these characteristics are measuring in the graph, it's going to make it a lot easier when we have to graph things ourselves. And that's coming up pretty soon.